Hi friends, Pastor Terry here. We are Dalhousie Church, and this is the 10-Minute Coach. Let me take you back into the book of James. We're in our series, The Big Picture, the story of God among us, and we've been examining this idea that God has been writing a story throughout history with himself at the center of it. He is the star, he is the hero, he is the one who created it, he is the one who has intervened when we messed it up, he is the one who persevered through the nation of Israel, he's the one who has persevered through the coming of Jesus and coming himself among us, and he is the one who continues to walk with his church. We see the beginning of that account in the book of Acts, and then letters written to encourage the early church and to encourage the church as we continue the church of Jesus Christ. This is the story of God among us. I've created some sort of mini-series titles in this, such as The Ancient Telling of God's Story. A telling of a story is a testimony. Last Sunday, we heard 3 different people give their testimonies concerning what God was doing in their lives, and we walked away very encouraged. Here we have the ancient telling of God's story, and we're to walk away encouraged that God perseveres even with people who have been rebellious and obstinate, and he prevails regardless of what's going on. They get to choose, was it going to be the easy way or the hard way? And most often humanity seems to prefer the hard way. We persevered. We went on into the foretelling of God's story as we looked at the prophets through the season of Advent, and the foretelling of God's story, the testimony that was there and the anticipation that was going to come. And now we're in the new telling of God's story. As we've stepped into the New Testament, Jesus came among us as the fulfillment of the Old Testament expectation, the fulfillment of God's promises there, and we are grafted into the people of God to become the new people of God together. We are the church. This is the kind of the back story to the story that we were telling on Sunday, and taking a different approach to it. The reality is that the vast majority, that's not quite true. Over 50% of the Bible is narrative. It's storytelling, and I think it's worth thinking about that. What does it mean for Genesis and Exodus and Numbers, or a portion of Numbers at least, for 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, portions of the book of Isaiah, to be storytelling. They recount for us the narrative of what took place, as opposed to didactic teaching, which would tell us what ought to take place, which brings instruction. The Psalms bring instruction in artistic form. The Proverbs bring instruction in pithy, short, they're proverbs, truisms. Generally speaking, this is the way it ought to be. The prophets brought specific instruction. Come on, you guys, shape up. The letters that are written by Paul and Peter and James and John, Jude, these are intended to be instructive. They teach us, but that is one portion of the pages of Scripture. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, storytelling. Within the Gospels, Jesus very famously tells stories. We need to think about this. Why is it that this is a big part of how God reveals himself? We have dare I say, the obscurity of God's revelation of himself in nature. Obscure is a harsh word. But we refer to it as general revelation because God is seen in the beauty of the trees, the mountains, the power of the ocean. We see a reflection of the Creator in the created realm around us. Story does a similar kind of thing. What was the point of that story? Jesus, Good Samaritan, some of the various parables that Jesus told. We're left sometimes to say, what do you take away from that? In order to understand the story, we need to understand all of the stories, and then we need to understand them in the context of the great story. And that just requires work. It requires time. That's part of what we're doing right here. We're trying to understand this. In the spirit of storytelling, we typically see first-person storytelling taken place on the movie screen or in the theater. And we enter into an agreement with the actors, we as audience, together with they, that we're going to pretend that they are who they are saying they are in order to facilitate the process of storytelling. George Clooney is George Clooney, but when he becomes Danny Ocean in the Ocean series, we say, okay, I know that you're really not a master criminal who's knocking off casinos in Las Vegas. We do this all the time. When we go to the theater, we can see props, we can see stage, we know what we are, but we enter into this. Where we don't typically do that would be in the church, or at least not as often. But I think given the biblical precedent, there's a completely reasonable thing that we would do in inviting just a little different perspective to become ours as we try to understand the places and the people and the times and the teachings that are present in the pages of Scripture. And that's what I've attempted with James, because we want to, what was it like to be the brother of Jesus? Good heavens. What would that be like to grow up in that kind of environment? Can we enter into the skepticism of James, of his brothers? I've given you some biblical passages, some scripture references in the sermon notes for you to it's biblical. They were skeptics. And then they became believers. Suddenly we're in Acts chapter 1. We don't know exactly what took place except the cross and then the resurrection of Jesus. As I put in the mouth of James, when someone predicts an extraordinary thing and then is responsible for delivering it, you got to stop and say, wow, maybe I've missed something here. I thought he was just my brother. Good guy. But maybe at one point I thought I was crazy. Moving from skeptic to believer to then writer of Scripture. And to be honest, I find the book of James a difficult book to make sense of. There have been times when I've read through the book of James and I've thought, he sounds a little bit like Jesus. Some of the things that he says sound like the way Jesus would have said those things. There have been times when I've read through the book of James and I thought, you know what, this reminds me of the Proverbs. Pithy, short sayings. There are a number of them scattered throughout the letter. But I think the most helpful way to read this is to look for themes that then come back again as a theme in an inductive kind of way. For instance, James chapter 1, verse 3, he says, you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Well, if you just did a little word search through there, you'll find the word perseverance shows up multiple times. And in particular, it's at the beginning and then it comes back at the end. And we can say, well, one of the things that James is concerned about is that we would be patient, chapter 5, verse 7, stand firm, chapter 5, verse 8, that we would persevere, chapter 5, verse 11, because there's blessing in it, an eternal blessing that we're looking forward to. There's another theme that is present that is worth paying attention to, and that would be the theme of wealthy versus poor. There are times when it seems like maybe James is speaking to wealthy people in absentia, that he's not really necessarily expecting them to be present in the church, but he's kind of speaking to them out there. You get the most profound sense of that in chapter 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming on you. Your wealth is rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. I'm not thinking that he's describing somebody who's in the church there, but he's speaking to the wealthy who are out there oppressing people. And we can say, well, maybe we can find some places where that is true in our society as well. This call for the ultimate justice that God will bring, but a call for correction even now. And there have been times even in this series when I've said, hey, wealthy people, if you're out there listening, this was back when we did Solomon, if you're out there listening, your wealth is a test. God is testing you, and in many cases, the wealthy come up short. But in chapter 1, verse 9, he says, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. So there's this inverting of the values of society that is present, and James speaks to that. There's concern for those who would fall away. There's a concern for those who would fall into temptation, and an encouragement that we, the church, would be those who would draw them back out of temptation. There's a concern that he has for those who claim to be people of faith but have no fruit in their lives. So these are the concerns that are there, and James is writing probably one of the earliest letters to be written, and he's writing to the early church scattered now, chapter 1, verse 1, 2, 1, he says, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. He's referring to the church. The 12 tribes, we had 12 disciples. The church is now carrying forward the mission of Christ, the mission of God, and there's a sense in which the churches are the 12 tribes scattered among the churches. It's part of the reason why in the monologue I used a bit of the Jerusalem church is kind of a cantankerous bunch, because sometimes it seems like maybe they were more Jewish than they were Christian, and I think this is part of what James was getting after there and around the world. I have a great time. I hope that you have a great time kind of reflecting on these things together. And I'm Pastor Terry Lee. We are Dalhousie Church, and this has been the 11-Minute Coach. Bless you, and bye for now.